Celeste, Hollow Knight, Ori. 3 amazing games with one thing in common: it's excellent platforming. My name is Ken, and I have made several attempts at making a platformer, from just small prototypes to games made for game jams. But there is one thing that I never got right while making these platformers, which is the feeling of the movement. Usually I ended up making the movement a little bit too floaty, and considering movement is the most important thing for platformers, this was really bad. A while ago I decided to give making a platformer another go. I ended up making something I am actually quite proud of, and in certain ways it quite feels up to standards to other great and amazing games. But before we get further into that, let's go back a bit and see the progress of how this game was created. The first thing is the idea. Initially I started making this game for the 1 AM game jam, which had the theme Combination. I unfortunately wasn't feeling super motivated at the time, but I did love the idea that I came up with. Of course I knew that I was going to make a small scale platformer. In this game I want the player to unlock several abilities, but only be able to activate a select few at a time. This makes it so you have to combine certain abilities to complete specific levels. The first thing that popped into my head when I thought of unlocking abilities was Metroidvanias. Now, I knew that I wanted to make a small Metroidvania with high precision platforming, where you unlock abilities that you have to combine correctly in order to progress through the levels. I thought of a short story for the game, and I decided to come up with the following. You play as a witch who lives in a dangerous forest together with your cat, Xavier. The reason the forest is so dangerous is to keep human beings away, as the witch doesn't want anything to do with them. Quickly the witch realizes Xavier is missing and decides to go searching for him. So after I got the idea and the story completely fleshed out, I decided to move on to the next step, which is making the perfect player controller for my game, which takes care of everything movement related. The reason I say perfect is because the player controller that I make now should never be changed afterwards. Once it's done and finalized, I should never touch it again. This is because once I start making levels, changing any value of the player movement just slightly would completely break the level. Like I said previously, every platformer game that I made before felt a bit too floaty. I tinkered around a lot with different values using Unity's rigid body, but I couldn't get the right feeling for it. So what better way to solve it than to make my own type of rigid body and gravity? Jumping up should be quick and responsive, while falling down should happen even faster than when you jump up. That is of course to remove that floaty feeling that I've been talking about. Apart from the basic movement like walking around and jumping, I added a few basic things that a good player controller in my opinion needs. First thing is variable jump height. This is where tapping the jump key slightly makes a small little hop, and holding the jump key a bit longer makes you jump higher. Coyote timer is where you run off a platform and press jump. There should be a small time window where the jump still goes through, even though you're actually not touching the platform anymore. A jump buffer, where you click the jump key right before hitting the ground, the jump will buffer, and once you eventually do hit the ground, you will still jump. I added a tiny little ledge hop, and this is where when you usually would not make a jump by perhaps a pixel, it will give you that little extra jump boost in order for you to make the jump. There are a couple more of these little tricks related to the abilities that just make the player's experience a little bit better. Speaking of the abilities, I ended up adding 8 unlockable abilities that will empower the player's movement. Double jump, a dash, wall jumping, gliding or floating, and a couple more. I made a small area as a playground to see if the movement felt good, and once it felt perfect to me, I could move on to the next thing on the list. Level design is actually not something I am that familiar with. In my main project, Adventure of Duck, the levels are all randomly generated, so making these levels right now by hand was a bit of a challenge. Next to that, considering I chose to add a Metroidvania element, this was most definitely not all that easy. Initially I looked at the abilities and seeing the places I could potentially reach with those abilities. With that in mind, I sketched out the map with the position of the levels. Using the existing abilities I would have at certain points, I designed the levels in detail using placeholder art. Most of the levels I am actually really happy with, and playing through them is a total blast. But there's maybe 1 or 2 levels that I, in hindsight, could have remade, but I decided to keep them in. Mainly because I could keep on nitpicking so many things that I could improve, which would cause the game to never be done. Overall, I am happy with the levels, and that's the most important part. After the level design, I coded in some more systems to make the game completely playable. I made it so the player could pick up these little beans and add them to their invisible inventory. You can bring these beans back to your home and to your farm and grow them out to full plants and harvest the corresponding ability. In your inventory you can select the ability and they will get activated. I added a small system as well for cutscenes for the intro and outro. I added a save system, controller support, a checkpoint system, and an option menu with difficulty levels, volume controllers, key rebinding and video options. Now that the game is basically completely playable, I decided it was a good time for some art and sound. From the beginning, I knew I wanted the art style to be fairly simplistic, but somewhat unique for each level. I knew the game would mostly take place in the forest and areas around the forest, such as caves or snowy areas, so I found myself a fitting color palette. I drew out the witch with all the animations, started working on the home level with the witch's home, the farm, and actually a giant tree in the middle. And then I drew out every level individually. It took me so incredibly long because it felt like there was almost no end in sight, but I am glad I finished them all up. The levels are divided in separate areas with different looks. We have the regular forest, the inside of a tree, the caves, and the snowy areas. Once the art was done, I downloaded some sound effects and added them to the game. Next to that, I decided to make some music, which I am absolutely horrible at, but yet here we are. It's not that bad of a track, but it does end up getting a bit repetitive if you take too long to finish the game. Lastly is one of my favorite things to do, which is polishing the game with things like screen shake, particle effects, squash and stretch, post-processing and other things. The difference these things make is always completely insane to me, because playing the game just feels 100 times more fun. Once I finished up the game, I let a couple of my friends playtest the game and made a couple of minor adjustments according to their feedback. I'm gonna be honest, I get quite nervous asking for feedback, but it's definitely something you should always do in order to improve your game, as you always overlook certain things. I actually eventually decided to put this game on Steam, so I decided to set up a Steam page, and the game is actually live right now as we speak. You can go head over to Steam and buy the game for just $1. I am incredibly happy the way the game turned out and excited to say that I finished another game. If you want to support me, then feel free to like the video or subscribe to the channel. Maybe if the game excites you and you're feeling generous, head over to Steam and buy the game. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you have a nice day. Hopefully see you in the next video.